The taxi slowed as it approached the wrought-iron gates of Blackwood Manor. Beyond the tall entrance, the sprawling estate loomed in quiet elegance, its windows glowing softly in the late afternoon light. To Clara Bennett, it looked less like a home and more like a world she had never belonged to, and never expected to. Her hands tightened around the strap of her worn leather bag. This was just a job, she reminded herself firmly. She hadn't come here to dream of luxury or whisper secrets through grand hallways. She'd come because she needed the salary, because her landlord's patience had finally thinned, because her baby boy deserved more than second-hand toys and hurried dinners of bread and broth. "Good luck, miss," the driver said as she paid him, glancing at the child asleep against her chest. The baby stirred, and Clara gently rocked him, whispering, "Shh, Jamie, we're okay now." The gates opened slowly, creaking as if even the metal was reluctant to welcome strangers. Clara walked up the gravel driveway, her footsteps crunching, nervously until the manor doors opened. A tall, silver-haired man stood there, his expression unreadable. His presence seemed to fill the doorway before he even spoke. Mr. Adrian Blackwood, the widowed Tycoon she'd heard so much about. In person, he was even more intimidating. Sharp grey eyes studied her as though every secret she carried was written plainly on her skin. "You're the new caretaker," he said, his voice low and firm. "Not a question, an observation." "Yes, sir." "Clara Bennett." Her voice sounded smaller than she intended. She adjusted Jamie in her arms, careful. Not to wake him, Adrian's gaze flicked briefly to the child. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing about it. Instead, he stepped aside. "Mrs. Hughes will show you to your quarters." Clara entered the grand foyer, her breath catching at the sight of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. It felt like stepping into a dream she couldn't afford to believe in. She kept her head low, following the housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes, up the stairs, but her thoughts lingered on the man she'd just met. He had the bearing of someone who had built empires yet lived alone in the ruins of his heart. Later that evening, after settling Jamie into the small nursery attached to her quarters, Clara heard it, the sharp, frantic cry of a baby echoing down the hall. At first she thought it was Jamie, but when she checked, he was still fast asleep. The sound came from another room. Without thinking, Clara followed the cries. They led her to a door slightly ajar, spilling golden lamplight into the hallway. She hesitated, then pushed it open. Inside, a tiny girl, no more than 2 years old, sat in her crib, red-faced and trembling with sobs. Her curls clung damp to her forehead, and her small fists clutched the blanket as though it were her only defense. Clara's heart softened instantly. She crossed the room, speaking in a low, soothing voice. "Hey there, sweetheart. Shh. It's all right." She lifted the little girl carefully into her arms, swaying gently as she hummed. The child's cries quieted into hiccups, her cheek resting against Clara's shoulder. "She misses her mother." The voice startled Clara. She turned to see Adrian standing in the doorway, his figure shadowed against the light. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, those cold steel-grey eyes, watched intently as Clara cradled his daughter. I'm sorry," Clara stammered. "I heard her crying and thought—" "You did what none of the staff bothered to do," he interrupted softly. He stepped into the room, his presence overwhelming yet oddly fragile in that moment. His gaze lingered on his daughter, then shifted briefly to Clara, as though trying to understand something he hadn't expected to see. Clara rocked the little girl gently, feeling the child's tiny hand clutch her blouse. "Sometimes," she whispered, "all they need is someone to hold them." For the first time, Adrian's composure faltered. His eyes softened, only slightly, but enough to make Clara realize that beneath his armor of grief and power was a man who had forgotten what comfort even looked like. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, Miss Bennett. You should get some rest." But when Clara laid the little girl back into her crib and turned to leave, she felt his gaze linger on her, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to wonder. She closed the door gently behind her, her heart unexpectedly unsteady. She had come here just for work, yet already in this house filled with silence and shadows, something told her she was stepping into a story far bigger than herself. The following mornings at Blackwood Manor followed an odd rhythm Clara had never known before. At dawn she would hear the faint cooing of little Emily, Adrian's daughter, through the corridor. By the time she entered the nursery, Emily's dark eyes would already light up with recognition, her tiny hands reaching eagerly toward Clara. It was strange how quickly the child trusted her. Within days, Clara found herself humming lullabies while braiding Emily's curls, or crouching low to let the girl toddle into her arms with squeals of delight. Jamie, her own infant son, often napped in a bassinet by the corner, and whenever he stirred, Emily would toddle over and peek curiously at him. It was a picture Clara hadn't expected, her boy and the Tycoon's daughter side by side, as though fate had drawn them together. The staff noticed. Whispered glances trailed her whenever she walked the halls. She caught fragments of gossip. "Mr. Blackwood never lets anyone near the child. And now look at her with that woman." Some voices held awe, others suspicion. Clara ignored them, focusing on her duties. But she couldn't ignore the man whose presence lingered in every shadow of the estate. Adrian was everywhere and nowhere. He moved through his home like a ghost bound to stone, always with papers in hand, phone pressed to his ear, his expression carved from steel. Yet Clara often caught him watching her from doorways or across rooms, not lingering long enough to be obvious, but just enough for her to feel his gaze before he turned away. One evening, Clara carried Emily to the garden, where the roses still bloomed despite the chill. Emily clapped her hands as butterflies darted between petals. Clara laughed softly, crouching beside her. "You love these flowers, don't you, sweetheart?" she said. "She used to sit here." Clara froze. The voice came from behind. Adrian stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the bench beneath the old oak tree. His tone was softer than she had ever heard it. "Your wife?" Clara asked carefully. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "She'd bring Emily out here every morning. Said the garden was the only place that felt alive in this house." His eyes darkened, as if he regretted saying even that much. Clara looked down at Emily, who had settled in the grass, chasing a butterfly with tiny fingers. She swallowed, unsure if she should speak, but her heart nudged her forward. She must have been a wonderful mother. "She was," Adrian said shortly, then turned away as if to leave. But before he could retreat, Emily stumbled and fell on the grass with a startled cry. Clara reached her first, lifting the girl and brushing off her scraped knee. Emily buried her face in Clara's shoulder, whimpering. Clara kissed the child's forehead, murmuring soft reassurances. When she looked up, Adrian was watching again. But this time there was no coldness, only something raw and unguarded, as though the sight of his daughter clinging to Clara had cracked open a part of him he had long buried. "I'll take her inside," Clara offered. He didn't reply at first. His throat worked as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally he nodded. Later that night, as Clara rocked Jamie to sleep, she thought of that look in Adrian's eyes. She had come here for stability, nothing more. She wasn't foolish enough to imagine a man like him could ever look at her twice. Yet the memory of his silence, heavy with unspoken grief, stayed with her long after she blew out the lamp. The days stretched on, weaving an invisible thread between them. Clara would find fresh toys appearing in the nursery, things she hadn't requested, Adrian's doing, though he never admitted it. Sometimes when Emily giggled, Clara caught a faint smile tugging at his lips before he quickly masked it. But not everyone was pleased. Mrs. Hughes, the housekeeper, cornered Clara one afternoon as she folded linens. "Mind yourself, Miss Bennett," she said sharply. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't need distractions, and he certainly doesn't need attachments." Clara straightened, stung. "I'm only doing my job. See that you remember it." The older woman's eyes lingered on Jamie's crib nearby, her disapproval cutting sharper than her words. Clara bit back her retort. She reminded herself she wasn't here to be liked. She was here to earn enough for Jamie's future. Still, when she returned to the nursery and saw Emily grinning at her with outstretched arms, a strange warmth filled her chest, something that made the housekeeper's warning feel heavier than it should. That night, as a storm rattled the windows and rain lashed against the panes, Emily woke screaming. Clara rushed in, gathering the terrified child against her chest. She sang softly, rocking her until the sobs quieted. When she turned, she found Adrian standing in the doorway again. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was low, almost reverent. "She never calms that quickly," Clara hesitated. "Sometimes children just need to feel safe." Their eyes met in the dim light, and for one suspended moment, the world outside the nursery disappeared. Adrian's guarded walls, Clara's unspoken fears, everything blurred into the fragile heartbeat of silence between them. Then, just as quickly, he broke it. "Good night, Miss Bennett." He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the storm. But Clara knew something had shifted. Not much, just a flicker, a spark against the dark. But sometimes, even the smallest flame could change everything. The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered over Blackwood Manor. Days later, the air still carried a strange heaviness, as though the rain had washed away something unseen and left raw earth behind. Clara felt it most in the silence of the halls. The staff, already cautious around her, grew quieter still, as if sensing a change no one dared name. Only Emily seemed untouched by the weight in the air, chasing after Clara, giggling as though the world outside the manor didn't exist. But everything shifted one bleak afternoon. Clara was reading softly to Emily in the nursery when the child suddenly swayed, her small body going limp against Clara's arm. Panic clutched her chest. "Emily?" Clara shook her gently. The child's skin felt hot, too hot. Fever blazed across her tiny face. Clara's heart raced. She pressed a cool hand to Emily's forehead, whispering, "Stay with me, sweetheart, it's all right." Without wasting another second, she lifted the child and hurried down the hall. She nearly collided with Adrian outside his study. His eyes widened when he saw Emily's flushed face against Clara's shoulder. "What happened?" His voice was sharp, but beneath it lay a tremor of fear. "She's burning with fever," Clara said quickly. "We need a doctor." Adrian didn't hesitate. "Car, now." Within minutes, the household was in motion. Adrian himself carried Emily into the waiting vehicle, his usual composure cracking as he cradled his daughter close. Clara sat beside him, Jamie asleep in his carrier at her feet, while Adrian barked orders into his phone. At the hospital, time blurred into a haze of waiting rooms and hushed voices. Clara sat beside Adrian as doctors examined Emily, his fists clenching and unclenching on his knees. For once he didn't look like the untouchable Tycoon who commanded boardrooms. He looked like a father, helpless, terrified, and very human. "She can't—" His voice broke suddenly, a ragged whisper. "I can't lose her too." Clara turned, her heart twisting at the rawness in his words. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his, steady and firm. "She's strong, she'll fight this, and she's not alone, you're not alone." His eyes met hers, grey and stormy. For a moment neither spoke, but his hand didn't pull away. When the doctor finally returned, relief swept through them. It was an infection, serious but treatable. With proper care, Emily would recover. Clara exhaled, tears stinging her eyes as Adrian pressed his forehead into his hand, shoulders sagging with the weight of fear finally lifted. During the nights that followed, Clara stayed at the hospital with them. She held Emily when the child cried, sang softly when the medicine made her restless. Adrian was always there too, pacing, watching, sometimes sitting silently by the bed with his hand resting lightly on his daughter's blanket. On the third night, when Emily finally slept peacefully, Adrian stepped out into the corridor. Clara followed, drawn by the weariness etched into his face. "She'll be fine now," she said softly. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the sterile white floor. "I don't remember the last time I felt this powerless. With business, with people, I always have control. But with her..." His voice faltered. "I promised her mother I'd protect her. And tonight, I thought I'd failed again." Clara's chest ached. "Protecting her doesn't mean you'll never face fear. It means being there through the fear, through the helplessness, and that's what you're doing." He looked at her then, as though seeing her in an entirely new light. His eyes lingered, searching, almost vulnerable. "You speak as if you've carried this weight before." Clara hesitated. Her past wasn't something she often shared, but in that quiet moment, honesty felt right. "I have. Jamie's father left before he was born. Every day since then it's been me, trying to be both strong and terrified at the same time. I understand what it is to love a child so much it hurts." Silence stretched between them, heavy, with unspoken things. Finally, Adrian whispered, "You amaze me, Miss Bennett." Clara's breath caught. There was no flirtation in his tone, no idle compliment, just truth, simple, disarming truth. She forced herself to look away, her pulse racing. "You give me too much credit." "Not nearly enough," he said quietly. For the first time since she arrived at Blackwood Manor, Clara saw not the Tycoon, not the grieving widower, but simply a man, standing at the edge of his own walls, unsure whether to let someone step inside. And in that moment, something fragile but undeniable grew between them, a thread woven not from desire, but from shared fears, shared hopes, and the aching possibility of healing. When Emily returned home from the hospital, the manor felt different, lighter somehow, though Clara couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the sound of Emily's laughter echoing once more through the halls, or the way Adrian no longer carried the constant shadow of fear in his eyes. But what Clara noticed most was the way Adrian had begun to linger. He would pause at the nursery door, pretending to check on Emily, but watching instead as Clara played peekaboo with the little girl. He would join them in the garden, offering Emily a ride on his shoulders while Clara walked beside them, their conversations hesitant but warm. And yet, whenever the air between them grew too charged, he withdrew, retreating behind his walls of business calls and locked office doors. Clara, too, felt the battle inside her heart. Each moment of connection stirred something she had buried long ago, but every reminder of her position, employee, outsider, pulled her back. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold, Clara sat on the veranda, rocking Jamie to sleep. Emily toddled nearby, stacking wooden blocks with gleeful determination. Adrian stepped out quietly, a glass of brandy in hand. "She's grown attached to you," he said, nodding toward his daughter. Clara smiled faintly, and I to her. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The only sounds were Emily's happy hums and Jamie's soft breathing. Then Adrian spoke, again his voice lower. "I don't let people close, not to her, not to me, but somehow you..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Clara's heart thudded. She wanted to answer, to ask the questions that trembled on her lips, but fear held her tongue. Instead, she said softly, "Sometimes the right people don't ask permission, they just find a way in." Adrian's gaze met hers, intense, unflinching. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the world had narrowed to the two of them, the distance between their chairs charged with something unspeakable. Clara felt her breath catch, the weight of his eyes like a confession unspoken. But just as quickly, he broke the moment. He looked away, standing abruptly. "Forgive me, I shouldn't burden you with this." Clara swallowed hard, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You've burdened me with nothing." He gave her a curt nod and walked back inside, leaving Clara with the echo of what might have been. The next days were a dance of closeness and retreat. Adrian would ask her opinion on Emily's meals, then avoid her gaze at dinner. He would share a quiet laugh with her over one of Emily's antics, then vanish for hours into his study. Clara, caught in the tug of hope and hesitation, tried to keep her heart steady. She reminded herself, This is work. Nothing more. But her heart betrayed her whenever he let his guard slip, when his laugh softened into something genuine, or when his hand brushed hers accidentally and lingered a moment too long. One evening, Clara found herself in the library, searching for a storybook Emily had left behind. Adrian was there, standing by the fireplace with papers scattered across a table. He looked up, his expression weary. "You work too late," Clara said before she could stop herself. He gave a dry chuckle. "If I stop working, I think too much." Clara hesitated, then stepped closer. "And what do you think about?" His eyes locked on hers, stormy and unguarded. "Things I shouldn't." Her breath caught. She felt the pull again, the same magnetic force that had been building for weeks. He took a step toward her, then another, until the distance between them was only a breath. "Clara." His voice was low, rough, like a man on the edge of surrender. She froze, torn between longing and fear. Her heart screamed for her to close the distance, but her mind whispered of boundaries, of roles, of the fragile life she had built for Jamie. Adrian's hand lifted, hovering near her cheek, but he stopped short. His jaw clenched, and he stepped back abruptly. "This isn't right." The words struck like cold water. Clara lowered her gaze, her throat tight. "You're right. We shouldn't—" He turned away, his back rigid. "Good night, Miss Bennett." Clara left the library with trembling hands, her chest aching with what had almost happened. Alone in her room that night, she held Jamie close, whispering, "We're not here for dreams, love. Just for work. Just for survival." But even as she said it, she knew the lie in her words, because something had already begun, something neither of them could ignore forever. Clara had begun to count the days, not by calendars, but by the weight in her chest. Each morning she told herself she would be nothing more than an employee, that her heart was hers to guard. And each night she found herself replaying Adrian's voice in the library, his almost touch, the words left hanging in the air. The pull had become unbearable. And so when the offer came from another household, more pay, less complication, Clara knew she should accept. She had Jamie to think of. She couldn't risk confusing her son's future with foolish feelings that would never be returned. Adrian Blackwood belonged to another world, one she had no right to dream of. The letter of resignation sat folded in her pocket for 3 days before she gathered the courage to deliver it. It was a rainy evening when she knocked on his study door. Adrian looked up from his desk, the lamplight casting hard shadows across his face. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw the envelope in her hand. "What is that?" "My notice." Clara's voice trembled despite her effort to keep it steady. "I'll finish the month, of course, but after that—" The silence stretched. Adrian's hand tightened around the pen he held, his knuckles white. "Why?" Clara swallowed. "Because this was never meant to be more than a job. Emily is— Well now, she doesn't need me the way she used to, and I—" Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. "I can't stay where I don't belong." Adrian rose slowly, his chair scraping back. He came around the desk, each step measured, until he stood directly before her. His gaze burned with intensity, but his voice was low, roughened by something deeper than anger. "Don't you dare tell me Emily doesn't need you. I've watched her laugh again, sleep peacefully again because of you. And as for belonging—" His breath caught, his fists clenching at his sides. "How you've made this house feel like a home again, Clara. And I—" He broke off as though the words were too heavy. Clara shook her head, her eyes stinging. "Adrian, don't. We can't pretend—" "Pretend?" His voice sharpened. "Do you think I haven't fought this? Every day I tell myself you're only here for work. Every night I tell myself it would betray her memory to feel again. But the truth, Clara—" He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a raw whisper. "The truth is I already do. I feel more than I ever thought I could." Her heart thudded, painfully. She searched his face for doubt, for hesitation, But all she saw was a man stripped bare of pretense, his grief and his hope colliding in the same breath. Tears slipped down her cheeks. "And what about Jamie? He's my whole world. I won't risk him for a future built on uncertainty." Adrian's expression softened. He glanced toward the corner where Jamie slept peacefully in his carrier, then back at her. "I don't see him as risk. I see him as family. Yours, mine, Emily's. We're stronger together than we are apart." Clara's knees weakened. Every wall she had built threatened to crumble, but fear still lingered, coiling tight. What if we fail? What if the past repeats itself? Adrian reached for her hand, his touch firm yet gentle. "Then we face it together. No more silence. No more walls, just us." For a moment, the storm outside seemed to echo the storm within her, and then at last Clara let go. She stepped into him, into the safety of his arms, her tears mingling with a laugh of relief. Adrian held her tightly, as though anchoring himself. To her, and for the first time in years, she felt what home truly meant. Life at Blackwood Manor changed after that night. The whispers of staff faded into quiet acceptance as Clara remained by Adrian's side, not as an employee but as a partner. Emily clung to Clara with the fierce love of a child who knew she had been given a second mother. Jamie grew under Adrian's roof, cherished as though he had always belonged there, and Adrian, though the shadow of loss never left him entirely, learned to smile again. Not the polite, distant smile of a man appeasing the world, but the genuine warmth of a father, a man, and a lover who had chosen to live again. One golden morning, Clara stood in the garden with Emily on her hip and Jamie toddling at her side. Adrian approached, his hand slipping easily into hers. "She used to love this garden," he said softly, glancing toward the oak bench. Clara squeezed his hand, her heart full. "And now it's alive again, just like us." He leaned closer, pressing his forehead to hers, and in that moment the past and the present finally wove into a future, one built not on grief or fear, but on love, courage, and the unshakable bond of a family that had found each other against all odds.